morning, everyone. Good morning. It's good to be here at, where am I? First Baptist Church of Havre, Grace. And welcome to part one of our four-part Sunday school series on creation and evolution. My name is Jonathan Rufinat. I'm a born-again, Bible-believing, church-going, chicken-eating Baptist, in that order. And I'm Pastor Jimmy's brother, and so for the next 4 weeks, you'll be getting a double dose of Rufinat. And I'm glad you're used to Rufinat's going over time a little bit, because I might have to today. And I believe that the Bible is the infallible, inspired, inerrant word of the living God. I believe it from cover to cover. I believe that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and that he did this in 6 days about 6,000 years ago. I believe that in God's original creation, things were a lot different. People used to live longer. I think that most of the water is currently in our oceans today, previously was under the crust of the earth, and then about 4,400 years ago, all this water came shooting to the surface and flooded this world, a worldwide, catastrophic, global flood in the days of Noah. I believe that dinosaurs were created with man. I think that dinosaurs lived with man up until the flood, have since gone extinct, but that we can still study them not only through paleontology, through their fossils, but also through archaeology and through history. I believe that God gave us a reliable account of these events in his word, but that we can also, to some extent, study these things through the scientific method. And I believe that these two worldviews do not conflict with each other. However, there is a different worldview that is presented in public school systems today. This textbook says, "In the beginning, the Big Bang." Now, I've heard the phrase "in the beginning" before, but not with the Big Bang. The Big Bang theory says that 13.7 billion years ago, nothing exploded. And here we all are. That's where the universe came from. Here's Discover magazine. It says, "Where did everything come from?" It says, "The universe burst into something from absolutely nothing. Zero. Nada. As it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere." Once this nothing exploded and created everything, it exploded in the form of gas, and then all that gas had to collapse down to start forming stars and planets. Then everything that we know was created by this process, the same process that created the stars. This textbook cites the song "Woodstock" by Joni Mitchell. In it, she says, "We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon." The textbook says that she sums up the literal truth of what we are made of. What? It says, "Are we stardust?" To a large extent, yes. Stardust? That kind of sounds like a fairy tale to me. But then after these stars collapsed and the planets formed, then it rained on the rocks for millions of years and filled in the oceans, and then the oceans turned into soup. And then the soup came alive millions and millions of years ago. Here's a scientific paper that says "primordial soup that cooks itself." That's a good trick. But once this soup turned into life, then this life form started to reproduce and started to turn into other life forms, and all of a sudden, all of the living things on this planet were related to this common ancestor. This is what the textbooks teach. This textbook says that chimpanzees are humans' closest biological relatives. Now, are you related to a chimpanzee? Everyone say hi to Grandpa. Now, the textbooks are very clear that we didn't evolve from a chimpanzee. We have a common ancestor with a chimpanzee. So this is not our grandpa. This is our grandpa. That's much better. This textbook says that the ancestors of primates, that's us, may have coexisted with the dinosaurs. Well, I believe in that. I believe that humans used to live with dinosaurs. But I don't think that's what this textbook means. It says these ancestors were probably mouse-like mammals. Mouse-like mammals. Grandpa? Richard Dawkins, in his book on the evidence for evolution, talks about the time that has elapsed since our fish ancestors. Now, does Richard Dawkins have a fish ancestor? Wonder if that's on his dad's side or his mom's side. But the idea that the whole universe exploded from nothing is called the Big Bang Theory, and the idea that stars and planets can just form on their own is stellar evolution or planetary evolution. The idea that life can come from non-living matter, that life can just make itself, is called abiogenesis. The idea that this life form can turn into other life forms, that all life forms can be related, is known as evolution or macroevolution or the general theory of evolution. We often refer to all of these as evolution. Strictly, if you want to be scientifically technical, evolution only refers to that last part. But sometimes we call this the whole thing evolution, colloquially. I like to refer to it as the naturalistic worldview, just in case you're wondering about terminologies. But I believe that the scientific process is not based on authority or majority opinion or indoctrination, but that the scientific process relies on critical thinking, defining your terms, collecting data that is measurable, observable, and repeatable, and developing theories that have explanatory power and predictive value. I believe that the Big Bang Theory, stellar evolution, abiogenesis, and macroevolution are laughably ridiculous scientific theories that do not hold up under critical thought. I believe that these theories are taught in public schools and believed on by many of its students because of a pseudo-scientific assumption of naturalism that the world just had to have made itself. And I believe that any and all sides, no matter how ridiculous, should be presented in any and all arguments, no matter how controversial. So I think that in order to be educated on this issue, you should study both the creation and the evolution worldview. However, that is not done in public school systems today. And I think this is a very important topic. This textbook says that the Bible says that species don't change. However, the textbook then says that species do change. So is my Bible wrong? Paul wrote to Timothy and said, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called." One of our jobs as a Christian is to be ready to fight against false science. Peter writes that we should sanctify the Lord God in your heart, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you. And I think that Christians haven't done a good enough job of answering the scoffers and the skeptics about evolution, and that's why I do what I do. Charles Darwin said, "A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question." However, that is not done in public school systems today. And so what I'm going to do is teach you the alternative worldview that you're going to hear in most public schools, the worldview that is critical of evolution and supportive of creation. And so this first class, we're going to be talking about evolution, this naturalistic worldview, and the scientific problems with it. Next class, we're going to be talking about the creation worldview, what the Bible says of how we got here, and the scientific evidence for it. In our third class, we're going to be talking about dinosaurs and how dinosaurs fit into the Bible. So you can bring the kids to that. The kids are going to like that. And in our last class, we're going to be talking about the origin of evolution. Where did these ideas come from? How did they get into our textbooks? And what do we do about it? Now, I talk about a mile a minute. So trying to stop me while I'm teaching is like trying to stop a freight train with your bare hands. But we'll have a question and answer time afterwards, and I will stay as long as you guys want me to and answer any and all questions that you guys have. I have a lot of information to give you guys today. I have about 200 PowerPoint slides. So it's going to be very difficult to take notes on this, but we are actually filming this and getting some audio on it so that we'll have this on the internet as a resource for you guys so that you can look up all my citations, you can watch it back, you can send it to someone if you would like, and that'll be a resource available for you guys. All right, so let's get started. This textbook says the Big Bang Theory states that at one time the entire universe was confined to a dense, hot, supermassive ball. Then about 13.7 billion years ago, a violent explosion occurred. It says all matter and space were created at that instant. Now the problem is that this goes against the first law of thermodynamics, literally the first law of science, which says that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. Okay? There is no natural process that just creates matter out of nothing. Now, the first law of thermodynamics says that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. To make it a little more complicated, there's a second law of thermodynamics that says that entropy, or useless heat energy, never decreases in a closed system. What that means is that everything is tending towards disorder. This whole universe is falling apart. And this is what the Bible teaches. Hebrews says, the heavens are the works of thy hands, they shall perish, they wax old as doth a garment. The whole universe is wearing out like an old t-shirt. That's what the Bible teaches, and that's what the second law of thermodynamics says. But the universe can't be falling apart forever, can't be falling apart for eternity. There has to be some beginning to this. And so the second law of thermodynamics implies that the universe had a beginning. But the first law of thermodynamics implies that it could not have had a natural beginning. Now, the textbook's answer is to ignore the first law of thermodynamics entirely. My answer is that there was a supernatural beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. I have a lot of questions for people that believe in the Big Bang Theory. Where did all this matter and energy come from? That's just the first problem. Where do these laws come from? Why do we have things like gravity? And why did everything explode so perfectly? I mean, even the atom has design. Take, for example, just the ratio for the neutron and the proton. The mass of the neutron inside an atom has to be bigger than a proton in order for stable elements to exist. But the neutron can only exceed the mass of a proton by an extremely small amount, an amount that is exactly twice the mass of the electron. Now, that's a very specific equation to happen in an explosion. Okay? This textbook gives a lot more of these just so things that just had to be this way in order for our universe to exist and for us to be able to exist. That if gravity were stronger compared to electromagnetism, we wouldn't be able to exist. If the nuclear forces were stronger or weaker, if the electrons were more massive. This universe is just finely tuned for us to be living in it. The textbook says there is no fundamental reason why all the universal constants should agree. There is no fundamental reason why we live on this wonderful planet. Why are we so lucky? No one knows, and perhaps no one will know. It says, we have formulated a question whose answers transcend science and ventures into the unknowable. That's religion. That's what they're teaching. Okay? Now, Lawrence Krauss wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing, in which he is trying to explain this worldview and trying to explain the evidence of how he believed the universe just exploded out of nothing. In his book, he says, indeed, something from nothing may have been required for the universe to come into being. Moreover, all science suggests that this is how our universe could have arisen. I stress the word could here because we may never have enough empirical information to resolve this question unambiguously, but the fact that a universe from nothing is even plausible is certainly significant, at least to me. So he says that the universe had to have exploded from nothing. Therefore, that makes it a possibility, which makes it interesting, at least to him. Well, I don't care what's interesting to him. And to say the universe had to come about this way, and that's how it did, is actually a logical fallacy. He's presenting a logical fallacy known as an argument by fiat, which he later accuses Christians of doing, by the way. But the big question is, why does he say the universe had to have arisen from nothing? Why does he say the universe had to arise that way? Well, at the end of his book, he gives us a clue as to why he believes this. In the question and answer time, it says, are you an atheist? And he says, what I can claim definitively is that I wouldn't want to live in a universe with a God. See, he does not want to believe that there is a God, and that's why he has to believe that this whole universe just exploded out of nothing. And that's how he develops all of his ideas afterwards. But now, there's no evidence for this. Now, once this nothing explodes and creates all this gas that exploded out of nothing, all of this gas has to collapse down to form stars and planets. Now, how does that happen? This textbook says astronomers estimate that there are more than 100 billion stars. That's a lot of stars. Now, how did they all get there? The textbooks will say that all this gas started collapsing down due to its own gravity to form stars and planets. The problem is this goes against Boyle's gas law. This is not possible for this to happen. See, as the gas cloud collapses down due to its own gravity, it creates friction, which creates heat, which expands the ball of gas. It can't collapse down to its own gravity. All nebulas are in a state of equilibrium. They're in a balance. They don't collapse down. Now it says the balance between gravity and pressure in a nebula can be upset if two nebulas collide or a nearby star explodes. They're trying to explain how these stars can start forming. But the problem is, first of all, if everything is exploding away from a central point, nothing should be colliding in space if the Big Bang Theory is true. But second of all, even if you could form a star by another star exploding next to it, where did the first star come from? Now, this is a middle school earth science textbook. The high school textbooks don't give us anything better. The high school textbook says, for some reasons not yet fully understood, some nebula become dense enough to begin to contract. It says a shock wave from a nearby star may trigger the contraction. Of course, they never answer where did the first star come from. They still don't answer that. By the time we get to the college textbooks, it's even worse. The college textbook says, astronomers are uncertain how the first stars formed in a large nebula. However, once the first stars began to generate energy, they just skip over it. They don't even bother trying to give an answer to it. Now, this going back to the middle school textbook, it says gravity and pressure were balanced until something upset the balance. Oh, until something upset the balance. Then it says, research information on the formation of the outer planets, inner planets, and the sun. Then imagine that you witnessed the formation of the planets and sun. Write a short story describing your experience. So it says, hey kids, read the material that we want you to, and then imagine that it happened, and then write a short story describing your imaginations. This is science? The textbook says, describe how our solar system formed. Ooh, I was hoping they'd ask that. My answer is that God created space and earth on day 1, and then he filled up the heavens with stars and planets on day 4. That's my answer. Now, I don't think I'm going to get credit for that in class, even though that's the right answer. And maybe that doesn't bother everyone, but that bothers me. Okay? Now, once this whole universe explodes out of nothing, and then once all this gas collapses down to form stars and planets, you still have to get life to emerge from non-living matter. This textbook says scientists think. By the way, that's always how they frame it. Scientists think. They want to make you believe that all scientists believe this, therefore you should believe it too. I have a book called In 6 Days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in Creation. Now, can you guess as to what the topic of the book is? 50 scientists that choose to believe in creation. Actually, it's 51 because the writer doesn't include himself. But it has chapters written by mechanical engineers, biology, medical research, physics, genetics, mathematics, zoology, astronomy, geology, chemistry. All of these guys are scientists who think that this naturalistic worldview just does not work. I have another book called 30 PhD Scientists Who Believe in the Bible. You can get the website, thedescentfromdarwin.org, which has PhD scientists sign a statement that says, we are skeptical of the claims of the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Last time I saw, there were over 1,000 people that had signed this document. There was actually an open letter to the scientific community of people that were skeptical of the Big Bang theory, and they had about 400 signatures to it. But they'll say that all scientists believe in this in evolution. All scientists believe in this naturalistic worldview. Well, first of all, many thousands of scientists openly say they don't believe in it. Second of all, most people who believe in this naturalistic worldview will deny one or more parts of this naturalistic worldview. So someone can believe in evolution but not believe in the origin of life. Most people have never heard of alternative theories like creation. Most people teach evolution just because it's their job. And many people are ridiculed or even lose their job after they are outed as an evolution skeptic. You can get the book series Slaughter of the Dissidents by Jerry Bergman. He has 3 books documenting all the hundreds of people that have lost their jobs because they criticized evolution. These are teachers and professors and scientists that you are not allowed to question this idea. But most importantly, majority opinion means nothing. This is actually the same argument that the Pharisees used against Jesus. They said, well, none of the Pharisees believed on Jesus. Have any of the Pharisees believed on Jesus? They said, we don't believe in him, therefore he can't be the Messiah. This is the same kind of appeal to authority, logical fallacy that the Pharisees were using against Jesus. John actually records that many of the Pharisees actually did believe in Jesus, but they didn't want to speak out because they didn't want to lose their jobs. It says, for they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. And I think that's what's going on here. But anyway, textbooks say scientists think that life developed from simple chemicals in the oceans. These reactions form the complex molecules. These molecules may have joined together to form structures such as cells. Well, that sounds simple enough. Problem is, there's no evidence for any of this. Here's an article written by John Horgan in Scientific American. He says scientists are having a hard time agreeing on when, where, and most importantly, how life first emerged on the Earth. Well, the what is already a given, and you're not going to ask who or why because those are religious. So of the 3 questions you're attempting to answer, you can answer none of them. So that's good. He then writes a follow-up article in 2011 that says, "Psst, don't tell the creationists, but scientists still don't have a clue on how life got started." Thanks, John. Keep us up to date. Now, people used to believe in this idea called spontaneous generation, the idea that life could just come about by non-living material. This is called spontaneous generation. They used to have recipes for making bees, and what they would say is that if you killed a bull and you put it in your barn and just left it in there, then the meat would just start producing bees. This was called spontaneous generation. And of course this is wrong, and bees only come from other bees. And many people like Francisco Redi and Louis Pasteur had done a bunch of different experiments showcasing that no, life only comes from other life. This textbook says life came from life, in other words, not from spontaneous generation. And they use this in the beginning of the textbooks as an example of how you do science. This is good science. However, halfway through the textbooks, they change their mind. This textbook says, while life has not been created from non-living precursors in the laboratory, there is some experimental evidence that the spontaneous generation of life may have led to the common ancestors of all living things. But I thought you just said that spontaneous generation was wrong, but now you're teaching it as right. They start calling it abiogenesis later on in your textbook, but it's the same thing. It's life coming from non-living matter. The evidence they use for this is something called the Miller and Urey experiment. Their experiment was testing whether complex organic molecules could arise spontaneously under conditions thought to have existed on the early Earth. Bill Nye describes this in his book on trying to make you believe in evolution. And he says the experiments were intended to see if they could make something come alive using nothing but non-living chemicals. Do you know what emerged? Not life. That's what you were trying to make, wasn't it? He says, but something fascinating all the same. He says a handful of amino acids. See, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and then the proteins are the building blocks of structures like DNA. And so what they do is they say, we made a couple of amino acids in the laboratory, therefore we know how life got started. The problem is that, first of all, they made only 2 of the amino acids out of the 20 that they need. They've done this experiment many, many times. Every time they do this, they've come up with more and more problems. They don't even think the atmosphere is the same as Miller and Urey did. Their supposed atmosphere was debunked by their own ideas. But there's a lot of problems with this, but anytime someone says that, oh, life just emerged from non-living matter, say, first of all, life has never been created in a laboratory. They're not even close to creating life in the laboratory. Second of all, even if they did create life in the laboratory, that doesn't back up what they believe. You say, Jonathan, what happens if a bunch of intelligent scientists get together and design life in the laboratory? I'd say that probably proves intelligent design. They don't believe that an intelligence put life together. They believe this happened by natural processes on the earth. But we've never seen that happen. There's no place on this world where that has ever happened. If life were bubbling up in the hot springs of Yellowstone, then they'd have an argument, but we don't have any evidence for this. But if we don't have any evidence for this, why do the textbooks teach this? Well, this college textbook said the quiet part out loud. And it said, but without invoking a supernatural creator, the working hypothesis must be that the first living organisms must have derived from non-living precursors. They say, since God doesn't exist, it has to be true that life came from non-living matter. We're going to assume that God doesn't exist. We're going to assume that God didn't create this. And then we're going to work off of that assumption. Okay? And if God didn't make it, then yeah, it would have had to have made itself. But I don't know why we're starting with that assumption. They're starting with this atheistic assumption. Once you have the whole universe explode out of nothing, and then even if you can get the stars and planets to collapse down and form themselves, and even if you can get life to form itself out of non-living matter, you still have to explain how this life form changed into all the other life forms that we see on Earth, the vast diversity of life between you and birds and bananas and trees. And the textbooks teach this happened through evolution. It says in this textbook, today scientists accept the evolution of life on Earth as a fact. There is too much evidence supporting evolution to doubt it. Now, Richard Dawkins, in his book on the evidence for evolution, The Greatest Show on Earth, he has my favorite quote that I've ever read all time. Okay? Here's what he says. He says evolution is a fact beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt. Beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. The evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust, even allowing for eyewitness to the Holocaust. He says, it is the plain truth that we are the cousins of chimpanzees, somewhat cousins of monkeys, more distant cousins still of aardvarks and manatees, yet more distant cousins of bananas and turnips. Continue the list as long as desired. He says that didn't have to be true. It is not self-evidently, tautologically, obviously true. And there was a time when most people, even educated people, thought it wasn't. It didn't have to be true, but it is. We know this because of a rising flood of evidence that supports it. He says evolution is a fact, and this book will demonstrate it. No reputable scientist disputes it, and no unbiased reader will close this book doubting it. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Not only has he so convinced himself that he's related to a turnip, but he's also so convinced of his ability to explain it to you that if you read his book and by the end of it you don't agree with him, there's something wrong with you. I'm not even that arrogant. Now, every textbook has a section on the evidence for evolution. All these textbooks have an overview of the evidence for evolution. Now, the textbooks will cite to you 5 lines of evidence for evolution, the idea that you're related to a tomato. They'll cite direct observation of evolution, homologous structures, vestigial structures, embryological development, and the fossil record. I'm going to go through each one of these and showcase how none of this is evidence for evolution. They're all false lines of evidence. This textbook says evolution is supported by an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. And it says one of them is direct observation of evolutionary change. You can directly observe it. The textbooks will show your kids Darwin's finches. They'll show that these finches in the Galapagos have beak shapes. Some of them are slightly thicker or slightly thinner than the other ones. The textbooks will show Endler's guppy populations. They'll say that these guppy populations are brightly colored when there's no predators, and then they're drab colored when there are predators in the environment. The textbooks will show things like the peppered moth, where when the trees were light colored, then most of the moths were white, and when the trees got darker, then populations became darker. Now, I have a surefire way of getting you guys out of paying your taxes. Is anyone interested in that? Okay. Now, taxes are a real headache. How many of you have paid your taxes before and can verify that taxes are a real headache? Okay? Now, if you wanted to get rid of a headache, all you have to do is take an aspirin. Aspirins get rid of headaches. And so if you take an aspirin, it will get rid of your taxes. Now, that logic works, but it also doesn't work, right? See, what I didn't tell you is that I changed what the word headache meant halfway through the sentence. Okay? This is called a fallacy of equivocation, where you change the meaning of a word. See, the textbooks will say we know evolution is true because we see evolution all the time. What they don't tell you is that they just changed what that word meant halfway through the conversation. They're trying to prove to you evolution, which is the descent of all living things from a common ancestor, the idea that every living thing on this planet is related. But then they say we see evolution all the time, and they're referring to variations among living things. These variations are called microevolution. The textbook defines it as change in the allele frequencies in a population over generations. I believe in this one. I believe that there are variations among living things. You don't look the exact same as your parents. And even statistically over a population, you can have various animals looking slightly differently. So I would agree with this one. But what the textbooks are trying to convince you of is macroevolution, which is the idea of all living things being related. The creation of new species is how it defines it in this textbook. The word species is a little iffy. We can talk about that some other time. But the guy who came up with these terms, micro and macroevolution, it was done by a guy named Dobzhansky. He was an evolutionist. He noted that there was as yet no hard evidence to connect the small-scale changes within species, which he called microevolution, to the origin of new species or large-scale changes we see in the fossil record. That's macroevolution. But he said, we are compelled at the present level of knowledge, reluctantly, to put a sign of equality between the mechanisms of macro and microevolution, and proceed on this assumption to push our investigations as far ahead as this working hypothesis will permit. a sign of equality. This is a fallacy of equivocation, logical fallacy. Okay? The type of evolution that your textbooks are talking about cannot be supported by direct observation because it is, by definition, not observable. Okay? This textbook admits it. It says radical transformations of life forms can never be observed in this way because these transformations take place over vast amounts of time. Well, that's convenient that we don't have to give evidence for it. We don't have to see it. Now, the textbooks will then say that evolution happens through natural selection. It says natural selection is the process by which organisms that are better adapted to the environment survive and reproduce more successfully than less well-adapted organisms do. Now, here's how this works. Imagine you have a bunch of insects and you use an insecticide on them to try to kill off the insects. Now, some of these insects will be resistant to the pesticide. So those ones that are resistant to it will survive and they'll reproduce and they'll have the next generation. And so in the next generation, most of them will be resistant to the pesticide, just like their parent was. And then after a few generations, almost all of them are resistant to that pesticide. The textbooks say sometimes an insecticide that used to work well no longer infects an insect population. It says these insects survive insecticide treatment and pass their resistant traits to their offspring. And it says that this is evolution. The problem is that the reason that this happens is that a few insects in the population are already resistant to the chemical. Nothing new has just happened. See, natural selection is a selective force, not a creative force. It is quality control, not design engineering. It is survival of the fittest, not arrival of the fittest. Okay? You can't just select something new to happen. Okay? All this new stuff would have to come through genetic mutations. This textbook says that the evolution of eyes or wings had to involve mutations. No amount of shuffling of existing genes could get the living world from no eyes to eyes. The problem is that we've never seen any kind of beneficial genetic mutation that adds information to the organism. You say, I can prove to you evolution. We have evolution of bacteria, that they become resistant to antibiotic drugs. Well, the problem is that what's actually happening in the bacterium is that it's losing a piece of information. It's losing a piece that the antibiotic is attaching itself to. And so it's only helpful in that one scenario. It's not helpful in any other scenario. This textbook says that these viruses have no advantage in the absence of the drug. In fact, they replicate more slowly than the normal viruses. Okay? That's not going to get you anywhere either. See, there are varieties of dogs in the world, but they're still dogs. And they probably had a common ancestor. It was a dog. This is called microevolution. And I believe in microevolution. I don't believe that every living thing on this planet is related. And there's a big difference between these. Microevolution is just a shuffling of genetic information. Macroevolution requires a gain of genetic information, which they've never observed. And microevolution is observable, and macroevolution is not observable by definition. But whenever I hear this kind of argumentation, I always think of the favorite phrase of the skeptic. It says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you claim that every living thing on this planet is related, that's an extraordinary claim. If your evidence for this is that finches have slightly different beak shapes, that is not extraordinary evidence. Okay? Now the textbooks will then say we have evidence from homologies, from similar structures in different organisms. The textbooks will show your kids these four-limb structures of different animals and say this is proof that they're all related. It says these similarities suggest that cats, dolphins, bats, and humans had a common ancestor. The argument works like this. They say if we all evolved from a common ancestor, then we would have certain similarities. We do have those similarities, therefore we all evolved from a common ancestor. This is actually a logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent. You could look up the logic of this some other time. But the problem is that there could be another explanation as to what these similarities are, namely that we have a common designer. Okay? Things that are designed have these similarities as well. There was an evolutionist named Havre who had used the car as an example to teach his students of how we understand evolution and how paleontologists look at fossils and figure out evolution using fossils. And he used the Corvette, as an example of this. You could see the evolution of the Corvette. The problem is, the Corvette did not evolve. It was intelligently designed by people. Okay, and he didn't really realize this. In fact, anything that is designed can be ordered in these evolutionary sequences. So just because you can order it in an evolutionary sequence doesn't mean that it evolved. There's a lot of other problems with this. Really what they're trying to do is they're trying to explain what these similarities mean and where these similarities come from, but I don't think they explain it very well. They have to explain away a lot of similarities that don't fit very nicely into their theory. This textbook says one of the things that makes the interpretation of evolutionary evidence difficult is that similar features may arise independently in several evolutionary lines. This is when two animals supposedly just happen to evolve the same structure, and they have to say this because their ancestor didn't have the structure that they have in common. This is called an analogy, or it's also called convergent evolution. And it says, but analogous features have nothing to do with common descent. Just to give you an example of this, the eye of the octopus is very similar to the eye of the human. But our supposed ancestor didn't have that eye. So where did that eye come from? They say, well, we just happen to evolve the same eye because we live in similar environments. We don't live in a similar environment to the octopus, but there's a lot of things that they can't explain very well, and so they just explain it away with analogies. They can't even say that similar structures come from a common ancestor because even in their own theory that doesn't work. This textbook says, in essence, classical taxonomists would look at how many similarities one group has to another, and on that basis try to judge relatedness among them. The word judged is used advisingly here because at the end of the day in the classical system, subjective judgments usually need to be made about who is more closely related to whom. It is a matter of weighing one piece of evidence against another, but who's to say what piece of evidence is more important? You should be to say, if you're teaching this, okay? And it depends on which textbook you read. See, this college biology textbook says that bird and bat wings are homologous, but this other biology textbook says that bird and bat wings are analogous. They can't figure out whether they come from their common ancestor or not, even in the evolution worldview, okay? Now, you can randomly put any animal on any evolutionary tree of life, and I can explain it by evolution. I can say that any of the differences are caused by the changes in evolution, and any similarities that any two animals have are homologous if their ancestor had that structure, or I could say they're analogous if it didn't. And so I can explain any randomly selected evolutionary tree that you make. And if a theory could explain anything, it meaningfully explains nothing. The definition is also circular. This textbook defines homologous structures as structures that are similar in related organisms because they were inherited from a common ancestor. This textbook does the same thing. It defines homologies as coming from a shared ancestry. The problem is if you define it as coming from a common ancestor, you can't then turn around and say it's evidence for a common ancestor. This is circular reasoning. I'll show you. This textbook says the view of evolution as a remodeling process leads to the prediction that closely related species should share similar features, and they do. Of course, closely related species share the features used to determine their relationship. I don't know how you can write that and not realize that you're arguing in a circle. Okay, this is circular reasoning. They'll say that DNA gives us a better understanding of this, but this problem still exists with DNA. Was the DNA inherited from the common ancestor? Or did it happen to evolve the same way in different lines of evolution? Now, they'll then say that we have evidence for evolution from vestigial structures. These are supposedly useless structures in the body that are leftovers from our ancient ancestry. They'll say that the appendix is an example of a vestigial structure. They'll say in a distant ancestor it was needed to digest food. It serves no purpose in humans today. This is a lie. The appendix is not useless. The appendix is part of your immune system. Okay? And we've known this for a long time. We've known this for about 100 years now, that the appendix is part of your immune system. But they continue to teach this in your textbooks because they need this as evidence for evolution. This textbook says the human appendix is an example of a vestigial organ because it carries out no function in digestion. That's like saying your arms are useless because they don't help you walk. That's a silly argument, okay? They're part of your immune system, not part of your digestive system. The textbooks will say that whales have vestigial hip bones that were used when they were walking around on their legs when they were on land. These are the bones that they're talking about here, these supposedly vestigial hip bones. They're not hip bones, and they're not useless. They're actually used in reproduction. This is how whales mate. This is incorrect anatomy that is being taught in your kids' textbooks. Okay? What they did was back in the late 1800s, they came up with a whole list of 180 structures in the human body that were supposedly useless. They didn't know what they do, and so they assumed that they had no function. But the problem is that as we continue studying science, we realize more and more what these structures do. And so things that used to be considered useless, like the pituitary glands, the adrenal glands, and all this stuff, we now understand what these things do. And so as we learn more about the human body, we understand more and more about what these structures actually do, and they're not useless. The vestigial structures argument that they present in the textbook is actually an evolution of the gaps argument. If you've ever heard of the God of the gaps argument, that's the fallacy of saying, we don't know how this happened, therefore God did it. And that's not my argument. I don't argue for God based off of what we don't know. I argue for God based off of what we do know. We could talk about that some other time. But what they're saying is, we don't know what this function is, therefore evolution did it. But as we start studying more and more about these functions, we start understanding more and more what they do, and there's less and less for evolution to explain. As science progresses, evolution recedes. And also, a truly vestigial structure, a useless structure in the body, wouldn't prove evolution. Okay? You would have to show a gain of function, not a loss of function, if evolution were true. But this textbook says, if we imagine that our bodies were designed, then wouldn't it be strange for a designer to put in place these set of costly, specialized, and useless structures? They say if we were really designed, God wouldn't have put these useless structures in. Okay, of course they're lying about what these structures do, but why are they preaching against God in a biology textbook? I thought you weren't supposed to talk about religion in the school system. See, the truth is you could talk about religion all you want as long as it's negative. And we'll talk more about that in our last class, in our fourth class on the origin of evolution, as to what they allow in the textbooks and what they allow teachers to say that is negative against creation, but they don't allow anything positive to be said. Now, the textbooks will say that we have evidence from embryology that you can study the embryos of different living things before they're born, and you can see these similarities, and this proves that we have a common ancestor. This textbook says that human beings have gill slits as embryos. This is evidence that we evolved from fish. This is a lie. We don't have gill slits as embryos. These little folds of skin that they're pointing to are actually part of the eustachian tubes and glands in the throat. We never have gill slits. Jonathan Wells, who was an embryologist, he writes, as I was finishing my PhD in cell and developmental biology, I noticed that all of my textbooks dealing with evolutionary biology contained a blatant misrepresentation. That means a lie. Drawings of vertebrate embryos showing similarities that were supposed to be evidence for descent from a common ancestor. See, here's the origin of this argument. The idea started when Darwin misquoted a famous embryologist, and then that embryologist then spent the rest of his life trying to distance himself from Darwin, saying, no, this isn't true. Then a guy named Ernst Haeckel came along, and he was an embryologist, and he was an evolutionist, and so he wanted to convince everyone that evolution was true. And so he decided to use this as evidence for evolution. First of all, he didn't show the early stages of development. Those stages that you saw in your textbooks weren't the first stages of embryonic development, and the first stages look very, very different. He handpicked the stage. Then he had to handpick the animals that looked most similar in that stage to fit that, and then he had to fudge some of his drawings to make them look better. The early stages do not look the same. They ignore stages like gastrulation and cleavage and all these early stages of embryonic development because they don't fit their theory, but they don't tell you this in the textbooks. We never go through a fish stage as an embryo. We are a human being from conception all the way. Our whole life we are a human being. But this is still taught in your textbooks today. We still show these embryology as evidence for evolution, yet this is obviously not true. Now, the textbooks will say we have evidence for evolution from the fossil record. Now, I could talk about the fossil record all day long. We could talk for hours on this. But the textbooks will say researchers have discovered many hundreds of transitional fossils that document various intermediate stages in the evolution of life on Earth. This is a lie. Okay, I'll give you an example of this because we could talk for forever on this, but I'll just give you an example of this. They find this fossil, this dog-like creature, and they say, this is evidence for evolution. And I say, you're trying to prove to me the evolution of dogs? They say, no, we're trying to prove to you the evolution of whales. I say, okay. They know that this thing is related to whales because its ear bone kind of sort of looks like a whale's ear bone if you squint at it. I didn't even know whales had ear bones. But they'll show this in the textbooks, and a lot of this is just misrepresentation. Take, for example, Rhodocetus, which is one of the animals that they show you. They show it with flippers. No flippers were found on this thing. The guy who originally found it eventually said, no, I don't think this thing had flippers. They imagined the flippers, and then he turned around and said, no, I don't think the flippers actually existed. Okay, but they still show this as evidence in your textbooks. Okay, those fossilized flippers were not found. They actually found them in the wrong order in the geologic layers. So the supposed daughter species is older than its parent species. They found these in the wrong order, but they don't tell you that in the textbooks. They add stuff to the textbooks. They're shown in an imaginary order. None of this is drawn to scale, by the way. But most importantly, there's no evidence that any of these things are related. They just put them in an order that looks good to them, but there's no evidence that any of this stuff is related. Okay? They'll tell you that they know how old this stuff is because of radiometric dating. The problem is that radiometric dating doesn't work. You can get rock that was just formed in a volcano 100 years ago and date it to be millions of years old. And this has been done time and time again. Radiometric dating, there's a lot of theoretical reasons as to why it might not work, but we have to start any conversation about it by acknowledging that it doesn't work. You can actually use different radiometric datings on the same fossil, same rock, I should say, and you could get vastly different ages as to what these things are. Actually, the most famous of these dating methods is probably carbon-14. Carbon-14 should decay completely out of an animal in about 100,000 years. It should be completely gone. However, every single dinosaur bone that has ever been tested for carbon-14 has carbon-14 in it. So either dinosaurs did not go extinct 65 million years ago, or your dating methods are wrong, or both, but it can't be neither. We'll talk more about dinosaurs in our third class on Dinosaur Sunday School, but this textbook says, okay, kids, it's time for some critical thinking. Why is radiometric dating the most reliable method of dating the geologic past? You know, that's like asking, why is communism the best form of government? There's an assumption in the question, isn't there? And this is the kind of brainwashing tactics that they use in public schools that they disguise as critical thinking. But Richard Dawkins says that evolution makes a strong prediction that if a single fossil turned up in the wrong geologic stratum, then the theory of evolution would be blown out of the water. Of course, this wasn't true for the whale evolution, but it's not really true for anything, because we find these things in the wrong order all the time. This book has 200 different examples of fossils that are found in the wrong order, but they just tell you that, no, we've never found a fossil in the wrong order. The evidence that they give for human evolution, one of the best evidences that they give, is a fossil called Australopithecus afarensis. The first fossil was named Lucy. This fossil was 40% complete. And so the next time your kid gets a 40% on his science test, you can tell them that 40% is good enough for them. But Lucy had the brain size of a chimpanzee, the arm length of a chimpanzee, the height of a chimpanzee, and the hips of a chimpanzee. They said, wow, this is proof of a missing link. They said that this was a missing link because they said that they said that this had human-like feet. But the problem is no foot bones were ever found on this thing. The reason that they thought it had human-like feet is because of a rock layer in another country, perfectly normal human footprints in a rock layer dated to be 3.8 million years old. Now, of course, humans weren't, in the evolutionary timeline, humans weren't supposed to be around for that long. So this would be an example of a fossil that's found in the wrong layer, wouldn't it? And this was dated to be 3.8 million years old. Now, there's three different ways that you can interpret this. If you find a human footprints in rock layers that are 3.8 million years old, there's three different ways you can interpret this. One is that humans existed 3.8 million years ago. But that means that their evolutionary history is wrong, so they don't want to teach that. The second is that their dating methods are wrong. It's not 3.8 million years ago. That's my interpretation. But the third interpretation is that monkeys had human feet 3.8 million years ago. And that's proof of evolution, so we'll put that in the textbooks. And this is used as evidence for evolution in the textbooks. Of course, that's ridiculous. This textbook says that these human-like footprints prove that missing links walked upright millions of years ago. That's silly. That's ridiculous. They later found more fossils that they identified with Lucy as Australopithecus afarensis, and they found that it had grasping feet, like a chimpanzee. But they'll still teach in the textbooks that Lucy had human-like feet. They'll still show pictures like this that Lucy had human-like feet, and they'll still say that Lucy made the footprints in Lake Tole, Africa. I have no idea how an animal with chimpanzee-like feet could make human-like footprints. Never been able to figure that one out. But Lucy is 40% complete. Lucy is their best. Most of this evidence of human evolution is just a few teeth they found in the dirt or a partial jawbone. All I have to do is say, in order for a fossil to be admitted as evidence for human evolution, it has to be more than 10% complete. And almost all the evidence goes out the window immediately. If I say it has to be more than 50% complete, then all of it goes out the evidence. All of it goes out the window. None of this is good evidence for evolution. Now, if none of this is good evidence for evolution, why do they teach this in the textbooks? Okay? This guy, Richard Lewington, I think gives good insight as to why this stuff is taught. He says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, no kidding, is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. That's the idea that the universe just has to make itself. This is atheism. It is not that the methods and instructions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material cause to create an appearance of investigation and to set up concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. This guy, Aldous Huxley, who was a famous evolutionist, he had said, I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning, consequently assumed it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. Okay? He wants the world to be this way, and that's why it is taught. Richard Dawkins famously said, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. As David Berlinski quipped back, it depends what they're filled with, doesn't it? And I think so. But if you don't start with this assumption that the world had to make itself, if you don't start with that assumption, you just look at science and say, how did this world get here? It's obvious that this world was designed. It's obvious. So right up here is a solar system model that many of you guys may have made in science classes. Well, Isaac Newton was a famous scientist. He made one of these, and he made one that he can turn a dial and it could move the planets in their actual orbits as part of his studying of their movements. And so he made one of these. Well, one day, as Newton sat reading in his study with his mechanism on a large table near him, a friend who saw things differently than he did stepped in. Scientist that he was, he recognized at a glance what was before him. Stepping up to it, he slowly turned the crank, and with undisguised admiration, watched the heavenly bodies all move in their relative speed in their orbits. Standing off a few feet, he exclaimed, "My, what an exquisite thing this is! Who made it?" Without looking up from his book, Newton answered, "Nobody." Quickly turning to Newton, his friend said, "Evidently you did not understand my question. I asked who made this." Looking up now, Newton solemnly assured him that nobody had made it, but that the apparatus just happened to assume the form it was in. The astonished man replied with some heat, "You must think I'm a fool. Of course somebody made it, and he's a genius, and I'd like to know who he is." Laying his book aside, Newton arose and said, "This thing is but a puny imitation of a much grander system, whose laws you know, and here I'm not able to convince you that this mere toy before you is without a design and maker. Yet you profess to believe that the great original, from which the design is taken, with its more massive and complicated orbital motions, has come into being without either design or maker. Now tell me, by what sort of reasoning do you reach such a conclusion?" Amen. And I would have the same question to anyone who believes that the universe just made itself. By what sort of reasoning do you reach such a conclusion? The Bible says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Paul writes this in Romans chapter 1. He says, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even as eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Creation is obvious to everyone. You are without excuse. You have no reason to not believe in God. I heard an atheist once was asked a question, and they said, if you died and you met God, what would you say to him? And the atheist said, well, I would ask God why he didn't give me any better evidence for his existence. I got news for you. That's a bad answer. Every level of creation points us to a creator, okay? That's what it says in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 continues, and it says, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. Neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Richard Dawkins, who believes he's related to a turnip, had said, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochist, capriciously malevolent bully. Now, I don't even know what all those words mean, but that doesn't sound good. That sounds to me like someone who became vain in their imaginations and their foolish heart was darkened. And they always try to make it out like they're the smart ones for believing in this, that you're just this silly person that doesn't believe in the science, that they're the intelligent ones because they believe in this naturalistic worldview. Actually, the scientific name for human beings is Homo sapien. Now, the word sapien means wise. So we are the wise man. Actually, some people want to categorize us as a subspecies of Homo sapiens. That being Homo sapiens sapien, meaning we are the wise man. Romans chapter 1 says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And if you believe that you're related to a tomato, you are a fool. There's no two ways about it. It says, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. See, we are made in the image of God, yet we teach in our textbooks that this is Grandpa. Change the glory of God into corruptible four-footed beasts. That's what they're doing. It says, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature, that's us, more than the Creator. It says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. They don't want to believe that God exists. And that's what Lawrence Krauss says. He said, I can claim definitively I wouldn't want to live in a universe with a God, and that's why he believes in this stuff. 2 Timothy says, they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. And I think that's what evolution is. It's just a fable. It's a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale for adults. But if evolution's not true, then where did we come from? What does the Bible say on where we came from? Was there really a global flood? Well, we'll talk about all of that in our next class, in our second class on the creation worldview. And what about dinosaurs? And where do dinosaurs fit in the Bible? Well, we'll talk about that in our third class. And how did we get here? Why did the textbooks teach it this way? Well, we'll talk about that in our fourth class. But in summary, if anyone tries to convince you that evolution is somehow scientific, hopefully this will be a good resource for you guys to have to understand that no, it's not. And I think that Christians should stop worrying about this thing and start understanding how to confront it because it is silly and it leads to a lot of bad theology. But we'll talk more about that in our next class.